lecture series here at the Center for Global Security Research within the Lawrence Livermore National Lab. My name is Asmaret Asqueto. I'm the Associate Deputy Director of the Center, and I'll be your host today. Our guest speaker is Ms. Carissa Christensen, and her lecture is titled Commercial Small Sats and National Security, Opportunities, Industry Dynamics, and Critical Next Steps. Carissa is an internationally recognized expert on the satellite and space industry. She is the CEO and founder of Bryce Tech Companies in the US and the UK. She co-chairs the World Economic Forum Future Council on Space. She also chairs the US board of the UN-affiliated Space Generation Advisory Council. She'll take about 30 to 45 minutes to give her presentation, and then we'll head into the Q&A session. Although we are saving questions until the end of the lecture, feel free to start raising your hands electronically and typing questions into the chat while she's presenting. With that said, Carissa, welcome to CGSR. We're excited to have you today as our guest speaker, and over to you.
Thank you so much. Asmaret, it is an absolute pleasure to be here. I so much appreciate the invitation, and I always enjoy the opportunity to work with CGSR. What I thought would be interesting to talk about today is a phenomenon in the space community, which is the emergence of commercial small sats. We have seen the orbital environment transformed by the launch of thousands of very small satellites relative to the size of satellites historically. And I want to talk a little bit about what that means for the national security enterprise, what actually is going on in terms of those small sat deployments, and what we might want to think about from a policy standpoint moving forward to ensure that we get the most value from a national security standpoint out of this small sat phenomenon. So to start with, I thought I would speak a little bit about the relevance of commercial small sats in particular to the national security enterprise. If I could have the first chart, first slide. I guess the first slide is actually the abstract, and then the next slide. So I'm going to talk about the opportunities for within the national security enterprise to use commercial small sats. Next slide. And this is this is not a new topic for discussion. The idea that commercial small sats, meaning large constellations of small satellites that are providing telecommunication services or delivering imagery or providing information about the space environment, space situational awareness, that those capabilities, commercial capabilities, can be used in support of military, intelligence, and even homeland security activity. In fact, on the right, you'll see different kinds of satellite capabilities, communications, ISR, space domain awareness, as I mentioned, systems, also other types of systems, such as those that can move satellites from one place to another, or even alternative position navigation and timing, and the kinds of applications that are envisioned, and those have been laid out in a recently released U.S. Space Force Commercial Space Strategy and the DoD Commercial Space Integration Strategy. So the kinds of things that a commercial system can do to augment national systems include providing insight into the health of the ecosystem, providing a secondary resource to improve confidence in data and intelligence, particularly support management of access to satellite data because there are very large new constellations focused on ubiquitous broadband, to support deterrence and managing escalation through diversified architectures instead of only large satellites that are perceived as more vulnerable. You may have a hybrid architecture with large and small satellites. Those small satellites are arguably less vulnerable. One really important benefit of commercial capabilities is that you can share that information. You may not be able to share easily classified information, but commercial information that is almost as good or aligned with the classified information you would want to share can be shared with allies, can be shared with media to support strategies like name and shame or attributing responsibility. We did an analysis looking at the kill chain, across the kill chain, next slide please, and highlighted some of the ways that commercial satellite systems can be relevant or valuable at each step. And it's often augmentations associated with existing systems or occasionally additional capability. And over to the right, you'll see sort of the key checklist that says, yes, commercial capabilities can be relevant if the technical performance meets needs, if the time frame is appropriate, and if the risk is appropriate. And one of the sources of risk is the business outcomes of the operator of that small satellite system. But overall, data is the lifeblood of the kill chain. These satellite systems provide not just new data, but new ways of transmitting and managing data, and that may be an important resource going forward. So that's kind of the context of why we're even interested in talking about small sats for national security. And if we could go to the next slide. We're seeing significant activity across the national security enterprise in procuring either satellite hardware. The Space Development Agency is buying hardware very substantial, through very substantial buys from commercial operators like SpaceX and other manufacturers. Various agencies are buying services from companies like Maxar and Planet and BlackSky. They're buying data. I joke sometimes that there are now a half a dozen, front doors for commercial space in the Pentagon, but there really has been a significant increase in seeking to incorporate commercial satellite capabilities, particularly associated with these small sat systems, and I'll talk about why they're different and in some ways special, over the last several years. There's still the challenge of moving from study contracts or test cases or demonstration or pilot projects into fully integrated operational activities, but there's certainly some progress being made in that direction and a vision towards the future in support of that. And as an example of how small satellites have been used in the real world, commercial satellites in low Earth orbit have made a noteworthy contribution to the contract in Ukraine. They've provided intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance for UAVs. Commercial satellites have shown border buildup by Russian forces, have shown troop movements, and that have sort of documented the ongoing war, and that's publicly shareable, and it really has had a big effect in shaping the global narrative and arguably shaping support for Ukraine and the consequential impact on NATO membership, for example. Satellites have identified rapid capability of deployments. They've increased mission resiliency, and they've enabled updating technology insertion. For example, communication satellites, Starlink communication satellites, were viewed at one point at least as being relatively robust to jamming because of the ability to rapidly essentially reprogram the satellite. Now, that has not been without problems and challenges, the use of satellites in Ukraine, and really two big areas of concern that have been demonstrated are, one, the question of the availability of key commercial capabilities. If you are relying on a commercial system, and that commercial system has it's a commercial system which is shaped by the decisions of a board or perhaps even an individual private owner, and those business decisions may put at risk the availability of that capability. That's a very serious question. And then, of course, is that company financially stable? Is it going to be around next month or next year or 2 years from now, in such a way that you can incorporate it into your planning? And then, of course, the suitability of capabilities. Are systems appropriately secure? Can they be integrated into military architecture and missions? So some of the DoD and Space Force policies that we just talked about are designed to address some of those barriers. So that's sort of that's my pitch on the opportunity for small sats in the national security enterprise. Let's move into what's going on with small sats. Why are we even having this conversation about small satellites at all? And it's, I think, really interesting. We have seen in the last decade an absolute transformation of space activities. Next slide, please. And I'll talk about those industry dynamics. Next slide. So here's a great proof point that we've seen a transformation in the last decade in space. We have gone from about 1,000 active satellites in orbit to 10,000 satellites in orbit. That is extraordinary in a 10-year period. And we went from that roughly 1,000 relatively large satellites to 10,000 satellites dominated by relatively small satellites. And the relatively small satellites are, the threshold we use now is about 1,200 kilograms. We used to use 600 kilograms, but the small satellites have gotten bigger. That's still quite a bit smaller than many historical satellites, and I'll show you a picture of that. Next slide. Why? Why has this happened? What's going on? What's gone on in the last decade to make this happen? Basically, there were a number of programs focused on working on small form factors for satellites, including some very interesting work at NASA, and among that work, within that work, a very cool project that was essentially using a cell phone to power a satellite to demonstrate that you could deploy and operate a very small satellite. So the sort of, and we saw the development of a kit form of very small satellite called CubeSats, came out of the academic community. So we had small satellites available, but that doesn't necessarily translate into the development of associated businesses. The other profoundly interesting trend is investment in space. And that investment in space was sort of fueled by space-focused billionaires like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, who were focused on launch. That focus on launch sort of had a secondary effect that attracted investment in satellite systems. So the combination of small satellites that let you invest a little and still develop a satellite system that you could demonstrate and then invest more later, plus the perception that launch was changing, becoming more accessible, becoming lower priced, becoming venture, more commercial in a very dynamic way, resulted in billions of venture capital flowing into the space ecosystem. And so you can see by this chart that about half of that went to launch, a little bit went to in-space activities, but about half went to satellite ventures. And so really, that's what created this opportunity now. Hundreds of startup companies developing constellations of groups of very small satellites designed to serve new markets and disrupt existing markets. Next slide. And you can see that most on the right, Quite a few launches, most launches today carry at least some small satellites. And on the left, you can see that in terms of the number of spacecraft launched, it's almost all small satellites, although there are some very large satellites that are still launched. And you can kind of get a sense of the relative proportions there. The two lines on the left-hand side show you up mass, so how much mass, essentially, what does all this stuff weigh that we're sending into orbit? And a few years ago, we had a crossover point where the small satellites, even though they're so much smaller, there's so many of them, the up mass actually significantly exceeds the total mass of the large satellite. So that's sort of what's been going on, what's created this situation. Next slide. And here's the picture of a small satellite. So you can see that I mentioned those KITT CubeSats. They're very tiny compared to a human. And you can see the Starlink satellite, that's an 800 kilogram Starlink satellite. There are larger Starlinks currently deploying. But you can see that those are very small compared to, for example, the WorldView satellite up in the upper right-hand corner, or that massive telecom satellite in the middle. Next slide. So really, so this phenomenon of small sats dominating orbits, hundreds of new businesses starting, billions of dollars flowing into the industry. There certainly has been global activity, but really, this phenomenon is largely commercial. And you can see here, of those small sats launched in 2023, the gold and dark gold are commercial operators, and the blue and gray are not-for-profit and government operators. So this is a commercial phenomenon. Next slide. It is also largely an American phenomenon. Again, certainly there has been global activity. China is active and interested, and in fact, just deployed the first satellites of a large telecom constellation. The UK hosts one of the first broadband telecom satellite ventures, OneWeb. But as we've seen, as you can see here, the majority of satellites, of small sats launched, have come from the U.S. In support of U.S. operators, and that's really dominated by SpaceX and Starlink. Next slide. So what do these things do? What do these satellites do? You can see that that's changed over time, over this 10-year period. We started out with small constellations of tens of satellites, maybe 100 satellites. The green remote sensing constellations, that's companies like Planet, for example. Those satellites are imaging the Earth with rapid revisit. We've moved to being dominated by communication satellites over on the right, the light purple, with a big chunk of test and development satellites in the middle of the dark purple. Those telecommunications constellations are hundreds of satellites or thousands of satellites, and again, very much dominated in terms of deployments to date by SpaceX's Starlink broadband constellation, with future very large constellations expected, including one being developed by Amazon called Kuiper. So next slide. And so this phenomenon of small sat constellations is really shaping the economics of the space industry. Most launches carry small satellites, and 2/3 of U.S. launches in 2023 were specifically for the SpaceX Starlink system. We're seeing national security architectures really shifting towards small sats, and I think that quotation in the middle is very powerful. We're moving away from building a small number of highly capable but vulnerable large satellites to proliferated, resilient missile warning architecture, but that can be applied across the national security enterprise. Now, I do need to interject here that robust, resilient constellations of small satellites versus highly specialized large satellites, I do think that there is that trade space is important. I and other people think that perhaps, you know, we moved a little bit too aggressively and far conceptually in focusing on, I'm going to overstate, transforming everything into a small sat constellation, a distributed constellation. I think we're finding more of a balance, thinking about, again, hybrid architectures, large and small satellites in different orbits, but unambiguously, the national security architecture is transforming. Satellite industry revenues are increasingly shaped by these constellations, as is the industrial base. Next slide. So these are some of those big telecommunications satellite constellations I spoke about. You can see the relative size of the constellation by the size of the circle, and the dark green is what proportion has been deployed. SpaceX's Starlink is dominating. Amazon Kuiper, you can see up to the upper left of Starlink, a relative smaller but still very substantial. Down on the bottom, you can see some constellations that have been proposed by Rwanda as well as China. The G60, the Chinese one, is the one that just launched a couple of satellites and probably is the most credible of those. Many constellations and proposed constellations go out of fail before they're even deployed. So this is certainly not a roadmap of a definitive roadmap of the future, but this is the activity that we're seeing. Next slide. And I think it's really important to note too, we talked about that, the business case question. These massive constellations of broadband satellites that are aimed at providing ubiquitous service around the world, they are seeing growing subscribership, they're seeing a growing customer base, there's a good deal of interest. That said, there is still uncertainty around how that business case will close and evolve, particularly around whether underserved populations that would want broadband satellite capability because they don't have good terrestrial capability are sufficient to support these businesses, or whether these satellites will be able to compete to find customers that would typically use terrestrial alternatives. So the business outcomes of these systems is very relevant to national security architecture, future capabilities, and planning. Next slide. And so what does that mean? What's the so what? What should we be doing? I want to offer thoughts on three on potential steps there. So next slide. We've got really what I would call a moment in time for the U.S. to act to preserve small sat capabilities. And I'm certainly not saying that every small sat constellation operator is at risk of going out of business. That said, venture-funded firms have a high mortality rate. We have seen some very high-profile bankruptcies already in this ecosystem, and you might say that's fine. That's the marketplace. That's how things should go. But I would argue that we had this relatively unique surge of investment, of venture investment, that's pretty much at an end. We'll still see venture investment in space ventures, but not with the magnitude, not with the relatively low bar for business case that I think that we've seen over the last 10 years. So we've got capabilities that are being deployed or have been deployed that could be valuable to us from a military or intelligence or homeland security perspective. And those capabilities are, I think, at risk, at financial risk, at face business risk, that's certainly disproportionate to what we would normally expect government contractors to face. And so I think it's an important question to think about whether we want to act to ensure we continue to have access to these capabilities, and that the capability, the commercial capabilities we have access to successfully reside in the United States rather than in other countries that support the business cases of their businesses. So the next slide, I think there are three very fairly straightforward steps we need to take. First, determine what capabilities are important and identify the existential business risks associated with them. In that analysis, we need to consider ally and adversary commercial capabilities, the financial stability of key operators, and beyond just sensors and communication, we want to look at commercial capabilities for data management, for synthesis and leveraging space data. Secondly, we then want to align our acquisition strategies to retain the small sat capabilities that are most important to national security objectives. This is not a proposal for a business bailout. This is a bottom line strategy, a very pragmatic strategy for meeting our security needs in the most cost-effective and timely way that we can. We can think about target acquisitions for specific capabilities. We can think about allowing for 80% solutions, which works better with existing commercial capabilities. We can try to support competition in desired capability areas, and as in almost every industry discussion that we have, we can think about how to avoid letting overclassification derail acquisitions or prevent access. And then finally, we need to think about incorporating that commercial capability at an institutionally fully operational level. And of course, we have policies that we reviewed earlier that are seeking to do exactly that, continuing those current programs, sort of improving the usability or match of those capabilities by engaging early to add features that meet unique government needs, and very importantly, training with those capabilities as to prepare for the future. And so those were my remarks for today, and I very much look forward to the opportunity for some Q&A.